Well, we hope to keep this fairly informal, so I'm going to speak sitting down from the desk. Starting point, I want to just set aside the things that I'm not talking about. So I'm going to take as given, and I know that this is still a contested idea, so you may think we should discuss it, but I want to take as given that the discussion here is about research universities in particular, not just universities in general. So I'm not so much wanting to address how should we fund higher education or how should we fund universities. There are lots of universities. They have been growing rapidly, as we saw, massive increase in the number of students. And that issue, I think, is less controversial. The much more controversial issue, I think, is how should we fund research universities? And so my focus is on that. The second assumption I'm making is that we think that there should be research universities in at least some developing countries. And I realize that that's also contested, that we could have a much longer debate. And in some ways, the first session, my reading of the purpose of the first session, I don't know if each of the groups explored it in the same way, but my reading of the first session was that was a defense of the proposal, the proposition, that there should be research universities. We were a bit woolly in our language. We sometimes talked about world class, we talked about rankings, we talked about research intensive, and those aren't all the same things. But I'm wanting to argue that there should be globally competitive research universities, and that what does it mean to be globally competitive? They should be able to attract top researchers. In other words, they should be able to compete for researchers. They should be able to attract PhD students top PhD students who want to do their PhDs there and their postdocs. They should be able to attract research grants and research funding. And they should be able to publish in competitive journals. In other words, if they submit an article to a journal in which it is competitive to get in, which has a high refusal rate, they should get some articles in. That's what we mean by globally competitive, not just in local journals or in journals which are set up and run by the universities for their own researchers. Now, I'm not going to argue that there should be. I'm hoping that enough of the discussion has already taken place to say that there should be. And so the question I'm addressing is, what is the relationship with government? How do we engage government? And what are appropriate ways of funding? And so the third thing I want to say is that I don't think every country should have strong, globally competitive research universities. Certainly high-income countries should, and I want to make the case that middle-income countries should as well, but I'm quite sanguine about the question of whether poor countries should. In fact, I think they can't afford it. They can't afford at this stage of their development to have globally competitive research universities, and to some extent putting money into that, I think, is just throwing good money after bad. I think, however, that is different from saying that they shouldn't do research. They should do research. It's different from saying that they couldn't have centers of excellence. They could in particular fields. The example was given: economics, agriculture, infectious diseases, and those can be certainly globally competitive. But the university isn't going to be a globally competitive research university. It's not going to appear on rankings that primarily focus on research. It's also, of course, not an argument against their ability, the encouraging them to collaborate and partner with universities in wealthier countries where research is stronger. But the challenge of funding research universities, in my view, doesn't even apply in those very poor countries. What I do think those poor countries need is differentiation. They still need to have some universities which are primarily undergraduate colleges, some universities which offer PhD degrees, postgraduate, and there should only be a few. So it's not saying all of their universities should be the same, and the ones that offer postgraduate qualifications should indeed be doing research, but they're not going to be globally competitive. So now I'm going to focus on the group of middle and upper middle income countries, such as India, China, South Africa, Brazil, Nigeria, many others, many of the North Egypt, others in north of the Sahara, who, in spite of this argument, in spite of having narrowed the focus, still do not have. So in the top 200 times higher education country at times higher education rankings, for all of its faults, etc., in the top 200, there are only 4 universities from middle and higher middle income countries. There are none from lower income countries. And the 4 are 2 from China, 1 from Brazil, and 1 from Africa, and that's the University of Cape Town. So these are countries, and there are a lot of them, and it covers a massive population. Close to a third of the more than a third of the population of the world are in these countries. These are countries which should have some globally competitive research universities. Now, so that's the I hope that's not going to be too controversial, just as a starting point. My next sort of proposition is that outside of the US and a couple of universities in Japan, there are no serious globally competitive research universities in the private sector. And so what that means is research universities are publicly funded by government, basically. They're public institutions. I've invited Raj to join our panel, though he wasn't on the program, because I do think it's important for someone from a private university to at least present another view to my view, and or at least moderate my view. I'm presenting it a little more strongly, perhaps, than is necessary, but it's in my view true for most countries, for most situations that we're talking about. It's not helpful to focus on the exceptions. So if almost all globally competitive research universities are public universities, then the funding is from government. There's not a whole lot more to say about it. But what are the mechanisms, and why has it been such a struggle? Well, the struggle has largely been politics. And in most countries, and especially developing countries, there has been, and we understand why, and this was the case in many developed countries too, a great discomfort with funding universities unequally. In some countries, in some places, you can understand it, in some cases just driven by a formula. For example, many countries have funding systems, public funding systems that allocate money per capita. Basically, some formula that allocates money to universities in proportion to the number of students they have. Or the money follows the students. In other words, students get loans, the loans go to pay fees, but in effect you're funding the university in proportion to the number of students. And it may be weighted by the kind of degree and by whether it's postgraduate or undergraduate, but it's some variation of that. That is a very egalitarian approach to funding universities. The problem is none of the countries, I don't believe wealthy countries can either, but certainly middle-income countries cannot afford to have every university a globally competitive research university, because they are much more expensive to run. Essentially, you need academics who are only spending half of their time teaching undergraduates, perhaps a third supervising postgraduates, and the rest of their time doing their own research. That is much more expensive than, for example, an undergraduate college, which can churn out where staff are spending most of their time doing teaching and marking. If you're going to have a natural sciences research university, you're going to have to invest heavily in infrastructure. I heard Leonard arguing that a mathematician only needs a pencil, and that the fact that you don't have the internet should not be an excuse for poor research outcome. That may be the case in a few disciplines, but I beg to differ. Most of the evidence is that the top research universities are investing very heavily in equipment and in research, especially in the life sciences and in the natural sciences. What that means is that no country can afford to fund all universities equally at the level of research universities. Now, some countries have taken the bull by the horns and said, we are going to select out a small number of universities and fund them differently. And my argument is that is what has to happen if you're going to, as uncomfortable as that is, if you're going to have research universities in developing countries. China in the 1990s embarked on a program called the 985. They chose 9 universities, and they said, we have none in the top 400 or something, we are going to get them there. And they invested massively in those 9 universities. Now they've expanded it to 30 universities, and they have those universities in the top 200. They have, I mentioned 2 already in the Times Higher Education, about 7, I think, in the top 400. And you saw what's happened to their publications. They are buying up academics, they are investing in infrastructure, they're providing scholarships for PhD and postdocs, and they're doing it. Japan is starting to do the same. Taiwan has done it. Germany discovered they had almost no universities in the top 200. So they said, we are going to embark on the Excellence Project. They selected 5 universities in the first instance, and they fund them much more heavily than the other universities. Denmark has and France have created mergers of universities. The University of Paris is a new university merged from the separate écoles, primarily driven by the need to become competitive from research and to fund them differently. So governments in developing countries have to grasp this nettle. Now, it is difficult, and in Nigeria, for example, there are 36 states, and for the federal government to say we are going to fund 3 universities, it means at least 33 states will not have research universities. You can't really do that in Nigeria. In South Africa, the legacy of apartheid means that the universities that would be most likely to be research universities are the historically white universities, which were always well-resourced compared to the others. It's unlikely that government is going to fund those universities heavily compared to the others. And so these are political challenges, but I think there are also ways around them. And some of them are, and I'm going to run out of time. We'll pick these up in the discussion. So were you telling me I'm going to run out of time? Thank you. So I'll just give one example, and that is the separation of funding by government between funding higher education and funding research. So the creation of science councils or research councils like the NIH in the States or the NSF or the research councils in the UK or the EU funding mechanisms, which fund research based on grant proposals on a competitive bid basis. So that what that achieves is that the universities that are stronger are able to be successful in raising the extra funds required to fund research. But it has to be, you have to kickstart it. You can't, the problem is that you can't bid competitively if you aren't already fairly strong. So you've got to have slightly modified mechanisms. You've got to protect those, you've got to invest in seed money. You've got to allow significant overheads. You can't fund research and say no money for the overheads because these universities don't have other funds for the core salaries and the budgets. So that's the first issue, is the money from government needs to be, if either the government needs to say we are going to select out the research universities and we will have 3 or 4, or it needs to find other mechanisms so that it happens without making it so obvious through competitive bidding. The second area, I think, is that governments need to give the universities much more autonomy. And the autonomy includes 3 particular elements. One is the right to appoint who they want. I think most of us take that for granted, but in many countries that's still not the case. So academics to be appointed based on the quality. The second is the right to charge fees, to set your own fees. In many developing countries, fees are set, and so they are in Britain too, they're capped. Fees are capped or set by government. And what that means is all universities generate the same amount of income. Fortunately, in South Africa, universities are free to set their own fees. And this is the key thing that enables some universities to have a total income that is probably double what other universities have. And the higher fees enables us to have a much better staff-student ratio. And the staff-student ratio has a knock-on effect both on the quality of education, but importantly on the amount of time available for research and for grant writing. So that's a key element, the right to set your own fees and the ability to do that. It needs to be matched with financial aid systems so that you don't exclude the poor. That's another topic. And the third is the right to set your own salaries. In many developing countries, academics are basically civil servants. They're paid by the state on state salary systems, and what that means is you can't compete globally for a top academic from a European country. You also can't reward people significantly, and you create, especially in countries where salaries are relatively low, probably the most significant obstacle to research in African universities is consultancy, is that academics spend much of their time supplementing their income through consultancy work, which is necessary. I don't hold it against them because their salaries are often low, but it substitutes for time spent on research. And so universities need to have that. So I would say that The engagement with government, which is a key element of this session, is around autonomy, particularly in those 3 dimensions, around government policy on higher education, persuading government that it's appropriate to have that differentiation, and therefore that funding should follow that, and around the creation of funding mechanisms through science councils or something similar, which enable research to be funded in a different way. Thank you.
I also want to thank the warden for inviting me here. My name is Rolf. I represent the MasterCard Foundation in Toronto, and I'm very happy to be part of this joint learning that's taking place here. I am looking at education and the research university from the lens of finance. I've spent a good part of my career first working in banking and for a global institution, mostly in Asia. Before joining MasterCard Foundation, I worked for about a decade for a large research university fundraising for research. And now being with the foundation, I find myself on the other side of the table, but it turns out it's very much the same work. So the same problems, the same thoughts to be thought. However, this perspective of dollars, I do see, I do see representing myself and representing a private institution. I do see a difference that money, when I see it move, it doesn't move according to categorizations of the type of institution. So very often we see discussions not starting from what type of institution is it, but it flows in different ways from our perspective. Maybe just a few quick words about the MasterCard Foundation. Very young, very much still a learning institution, only set up in 2006 when MasterCard Worldwide did the IPO, became a publicly traded institution. They set aside a block of shares to form this foundation. The foundation was incorporated in Toronto, so we have our own board of directors. We have nobody from MasterCard on the board. Having said that, having been endowed at that very generous level, our assets put us among the largest foundations in North America now. We certainly have a responsibility to the brand. We certainly are very grateful for the corporation establishing this private foundation. We have 2 programs. We fund financial inclusion, and sometimes I call it microfinance 2.0, a little bit broader, and we fund education and learning. I myself represent the Scholars Program, which is a startup flagship program of the foundation. Funding right now, we have commitments for about 18,000 scholars from sub-Saharan Africa to study mostly in Africa or at a network of 21 worldwide global institutions. The program is about 3 years old, we fund secondary education, 4-year undergrads and 2-year masters. We don't do funding at the primary level, and we don't fund at the PhD level because we are, after the education phase, we are very much interested where the scholars go and how they link back to markets. Those questions we had set ourselves to discuss here today. What funding models and partnerships can best support institutions? My knowledge is mostly North Africa, but then also I have worked many years in Asia, have through my time at Michigan State University have learned about Africa, I have traveled there, but certainly I'm not an expert there. But I do see that many of the money-driven principles apply from my time as a commercial banker in Asia all the way back to now at the foundation looking at Africa. When you look at the current market, and the US represents a part of it, when you look, the Pew Research Center just looked at higher education and said, what are the current big buckets that make up funding for public institutions? We come up with 4 pieces. Tuition, on the average, 21%, self-supporting activities, 21%, private fundraising on the average across North America, now something like 10%, and then the biggest piece of the pie, just like what the Vice Chancellor said, government support, still at 37%. So those 4 parts pretty much are what we have to look for, where most of the dollars are coming from. And I want to just quickly speak about, or comment to these government philanthropy and the third point. On government funding, one of the learnings is, I want to share a high level of caution. Within the environment of a research university at Michigan State, I have seen state funding, I've not all seen it, I've seen the last decade, over a period of 20 years go from 70% of general funds down to 20%. I've seen tuition going from 10-15% of general budget of the university up to 70%. So public support and tuition made a great X in the funding chart of a major research university, and that is definitely a trend when you look at what's going on in California and at many other places. Having given the caution, there's no way we can ignore NIH, Department of Energy, USAID, which is in the room here, and at a government supranational level, the World Bank, the #1 funder in Africa. I'm not sure if that's true in Asia too, but for sure funder of off-continent higher education. So government funding, yes, but be aware of a high level of volatility, which is totally new, and we do not know what will happen a little bit down the road. Then the second point, philanthropy. We will speak about that also tomorrow, we have this on this agenda. But just a few items from my perspective, fundraising and on the foundation side. Philanthropy and fundraising is much bigger than just trying to find dollars for the need of a big research university. Fundraising, if done right, has a potential to advance many different things of a university. Usually, with regard to the foundation, we say, when you look at us for social capital. We know people, our partners in Cape Town. You want to do research in South Africa? Yes, we're in Toronto, but we can call our colleagues at University of Cape Town. So we have social capital. We have intellectual capital. We invest quite a bit in research. We look at the themes that interest us, and we publish and produce research for our programs. It's not the research you are talking about, not that broad. But when you come to the foundation, also think about we might have some knowledge which we can contribute. And then certainly what we are all about, we are a financial institution, our financial capital. Sometimes this is a little bit lighthearted. I'm coming from having been a fundraiser. So one of the fundraising adages was, if you if you ask me for money, you will get advice. If you ask for advice, you will get money. So, but it means when you enter into a conversation with big institutions, look at them for support that might be going way beyond the financial contributions. Beyond philanthropy, I would encourage you to look at markets. The warden told me that he has a history, Gordon and Betty Moore. Philanthropy in itself is not a full answer. There's an organization called the Climate Change Network. And if you look at them, they want to have impact and do research and change the world around climate issues, climate change. And yes, this was a very important group of foundations, and they put together a wonderful portfolio of funding, several hundred millions of dollars. But if you just compare that, I looked up the number here after that conversation, on a daily basis, people spend 374 million gallons of gas in the US. So that's probably $1 billion spent on gasoline a day versus a year's funding of all the big foundations together, not even that amount. So when you think research, if you think big topic research, aligning with markets is probably something what is least well done and what needs to be considered. Another reason, there are certainly people who find that most of innovation, certainly when it comes bringing it to scale, which is not the task of university, is happening on the market side. So building these partnerships, universities with the corporate sector is just, from where are the funds moving, what is happening is just a total necessity. With regard to the second question, I will be very brief. Governments in higher education, how should we engage them? It's, again, a development rule, impact drives income. And USAID, for example, is looking as much for partnerships and us being broad than the World Bank and bringing other funders to the table. So how should we engage governments? We should share the knowledge we have, we should demonstrate the income we can have, and we should approach them in partnership and offering value like we would approach everyone else. Different roles of public and private institutions, we are agnostic on that. We are not agnostic when it comes to inclusivity, access, quality of the work. All these need to be maintained, but at least for our institution, we are, again, our starting point is what is the potential for impact when we invest, and we would not first be looking, are you government, public, or state? So I, again, just also want to thank the warden for having us here, being able to present. My sense is that the discussion we are having, it's framed Africa and Asia, but at least my view from North America is it's a global discussion. These type of changes and questions and need to even rethink what might look successful right now is strongly permeating the whole story. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much for, yes, sure. Thank you for both of you to have put this issue up for discussion. I'll keep my remarks very short just to bring a slight perspective, which is that although I entirely agree and endorse the fact that the good part of the development of public universities has been, or the research is in relation to the contribution of public universities around the world. And by and large, the history and growth of universities has been largely, barring the United States, around the world, it's been the public universities. However, my slight difference in relation to the opinion expressed with Max here is that I do believe that for all the reasons that developing countries are indeed having a huge financial crunch when it comes to contributing significantly to growth and development of universities, it is absolutely essential to tap on the potential of the private sector to invest significantly in relation to higher education. In fact, since this has not been done before, there is all the more reason why this has to be done for the future. In fact, I do believe that the health sector and infrastructure and many other areas, including primary and secondary education, will continue to occupy the attention of the governments in developing countries, and higher education will continue to be slightly neglected in the years to come. And if that is going to be the trend, it is all the more important that the resources that we need for supporting higher education has to be coming out of private sector. As far as the research within private sector or private universities is concerned, I think because of the fact that there have not been really world-class universities in the private context, it is too early to make any sort of assessment about what the situation is. But I think I don't see any reason why the American model in some form cannot be brought to bear for the development of many other private universities in Asia and Africa. In fact, my own view is when it comes to funding and resources, we need to be broad-based in our approach, meaning we should promote the development of public universities, public plus private partnership type universities, private not-for-profit universities. I would have normally stopped here, and I'm generally opposed to private for-profit universities, but one can think about private for-profit educational initiatives which may not necessarily be universities. We also cannot underestimate the role of independent foundations and think tanks and research institutions which are indeed contributing to research. I mean, for this audience, I don't need to mention that with an endowment of over $40 billion, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation alone is contributing enormously on a number of issues relating to education and health and alleviating poverty across the developing world. And this contribution, some of which can also come through universities as well as research institutions, and that's where the idea of private philanthropy and private wealth ought to contribute towards educational initiatives. We also need to re-examine the whole framework of the role of corporations. In this regard, I will mention that one of the very unique steps that India has taken, which has already evinced interest around the world, particularly in the developing world, is that a couple of years ago, India brought out a legislation for providing some sort of a mandatory corporate social responsibility initiative in which 2% of the revenues of every corporation above a particular turnover will have to be invested on certain specified CSR initiatives. Now, it was very beautifully worded. What it did was to ensure that it is not challenged in the court of law. It didn't make it mandatory or compulsory for corporations to actually give, but it made it compulsory for corporations which don't give to as a disclosure requirement. So it's a kind of a shaming exercise in which every corporation which is making a particular amount of money per annum will, if it's falling short of the 2% contribution towards CSR, and there are projections that this 2% of these major corporations will inevitably, as a significant part of it, will go to education as well. So in some ways, I'm much more sanguine about the role of private universities and private higher education initiatives, particularly to fund research.
Thank you. Thanks.
So what I suggest is Rick's group, which Rick chaired, Rick and I chaired, we had a rapporteur. So maybe Williams can, a little bit brief all of us about what we discussed.
I think that one thing that we did was we did talk about what we're discussing, which has been a feature of a lot of the discussion so far, in my understanding, in all the groups, whether we're really talking about all of higher education or just research universities or even globally competitive research universities and what that means. I'll just mention that we talked about that, but really put that to one side. Although it does obviously influence a lot of the questions about where the money comes from and how it's allocated and that kind of thing. But so just putting that to one side, I think that we agreed that if we're talking about sources of money and decoupling that from how the money gets allocated, that in terms of sources, the for-profit industrial sector is unlikely to support basic research. That's been shown in developed countries that just doesn't really happen. It's also, several people said that it's sort of unrealistic to expect governments in lower and especially low income and middle income countries to substantially increase funding to research universities. So there has to be some kind of hybrid model which involves governments to some extent, but also includes philanthropy, non-profit investment, and then in the sphere of applied research can then also include for-profit investment. So that's where the money comes from. And then we thought that it could be productive to decouple that question from the question of how the money is then allocated, where you then might come to something like Dr. Price was mentioning before, some combination of research councils and other sort of independent bodies or non-profit groups that actually make the decisions as to how the money gets to different academic endeavors.
Thank you very much for that.
Can I invite those who were in the group with me to share any take-home messages that you had, rather than me trying to say again? Anyone willing to? Shall I pick on people? Okay, Lee, you were the first. I'm picking on you.
Oh dear.
And then
I'm looking at this room, and as an old-time lecturer, I'm trying to figure out whether you can hear me without the microphone. Max led an excellent session, and I think by deferring to us, he's not giving himself the credit for focusing the conversation on, if we're talking about research universities, what model will work best, in his case, the continent of Africa, and in Asia, those countries that are not India and China. And he said that a research university is a very expensive enterprise and needs to justify its existence in terms of some kind of output. Max, I may be putting words into your mouth, because it will take a concerted partnership between among government, the university, those who attend the university and pay some of the bills, and the local economy. So with that, we didn't really come up to an answer, but we suggested that there might be a workable model, providing not every country decides it has to have a research university.
maybe I'll ask Stephen to add a few. We'll take a message from the session.
Only add, thank you, a great summary, but I think there were a number of different models suggested as to how it might be possible to focus resources, and it was acknowledged that politically it's often very, very difficult to do that. There are research excellence exercises which can happen. There was also just a general sense that very well structured granting councils, if I need to use that term, research granting councils, can de facto be a way of creating differentiation, which I think was a theme that emerged quite consistently, that not all universities could be the same. And I think it is important to say that there's clearly a distinction between understanding how to create a great, globally influential research university and how to design a system of higher education that meets the needs of a nation. Not the same thing. One is a very small subset of the other.
Thank you very much for that group, or offer a comment. So two other messages I took away. One was related to salaries and rates of pay, which of course suggests a source of funding which is not necessarily channeled through the university, but could be. And we talked about the US model where people effectively are paid 75% and expected to raise the other 25% from other sources, and how that might be a source of funding for research to retain and attract academics that would not otherwise be attracted for the salaries. But basically the need to address the issue of salaries as a core issue and look for ways of also differentiating those and rewarding research. And then the other was the question of whether, given how politically fraught it is to select some universities ahead of others within a country, whether there are alternatives to that political challenge, and two were suggested. One was the use of research institutes or research academies, either in parallel with universities or having people who are jointly appointed into these research academies and the universities, and there were different views on whether that's desirable or inefficient or solves the problem. And the other was a sort of super research councils. The example was given of the European Funding Council, which is supposed to give the equal number of grants to each of research grants to each of the European Union member countries. So, Czechoslovakia gets the same number as the UK. How do you overcome that kind of problem? And we were told that there are these sort of a supranational independent research council which gets the money and then allocates that on a competitive basis, which speaks to one of the examples I was giving in my presentation of if the government's formal higher education funding system can't differentiate, other research councils might become a more effective vehicle of differentiation. Is there someone going to speak from your group?
I had volunteered to do this, but I really would like the members of the group also to chime in. Right at the opening of our discussion, I would say this was a major sentiment that was expressed, is that the funding for just one major large institution is something really difficult to attain, and then on the other side of it, the potential of smaller but still high-class research units should not be neglected. So example was given that there's a school, or there might be a school in France that's producing Fields Medals recipients on an annual basis, even though they're not well known globally. So so the potential of the distributed model versus the research model, and I will ask you to comment later. Then on the funding side, in this discussion we were also pointed at the opportunity to give or to obtain research contracts. So that whole world of contracts and grants as it exists in a Western university. So just consider research contracts and whatever it takes to set these units up to obtain funding. We went a little bit off topic by talking more in general terms about the research university and not just the funding side thereof. But one of the discussion points was that everyone emphasized the value of the global collaboration, short-term exchanges of faculty, courses delivered through technology where people are not present. So again, the discussion that research can also be possible more in a distributed model and with the use of technology. When we spent one section of our conversation here on technology specifically, and really takeaway was there is, when it comes to technology and advancing and finding funding for it and advancing the major research tasks, there's a great difference between teaching some research or the heavy research. You have physicists needing a cyclotron, so distributed model will not work when it comes to the very high end. But then sciences like epidemiology, healthcare, and so on seem to be fairly advanced in already having this distributed model, which also lessens the load on having this funding of one unit at a central point. Comments from other participants of the group, please. Yep.
the focus shouldn't be just on universities, it would be on programs and departments. You can have top programs in given country, in university, which is not top. And also, the low-income countries cannot afford not to have a research department. Because one example was, for instance, a tropical, an agronomy center, world class, in 1922 in Benin. And another example from India is a rice storage center, which is world class. It cannot be in Missouri, it cannot be anywhere. It can only be in that place. It have a critical mass to actually achieve just that. So, and I think that was an important point that you raised. And then, I think, as mentioned, we talk about funding, which is the medical school model, where people apply for grants and get partnership with private sector, with pharmaceutical companies to be able to get major grants that they use to run a given project, which is in the interest of the private sector, or use to overhead to run the other. So the funding model based on grants and contract is something which is very important.
I just want to highlight two things which, at least in our group, we didn't discuss and I didn't think it emerged here, which is that, when you look at funding, what is the motivation for people to fund, at least in the private sector? I know we're going to talk about philanthropic impact next session, but the whole range of issues related to tax exemptions and favorable regulatory environment for people from the private sector to contribute to higher education. This is something which we didn't cover in our session, and I'll be very keen to hear from others if that was covered. And secondly, issue of funding and partnerships. For example, we know NYU is setting this campus around the world. We heard from the University of Nottingham, Vice Chancellor morning, that there are fully functional campuses in China and Malaysia. Monash from Australia has set up campuses around the world. If these sort of global universities from the developed world are setting up campuses in the developing countries, should this become a part of an ecosystem that needs to be developed in these countries, and to what extent they can potentially partner with local universities so that there is a sort of a heads up for some of these universities? Because one of the big things that is needed, if you look at it, and interestingly, Monash is a research university, NYU is a research university, Nottingham is a research university. These are not setting up campuses in other parts of the world, compromising their quality in any way. So can this imagination and this vision be brought into local campuses as well as countries in Asia and Africa?